a big part of being a songwriter is being at least responsible for your recordings. It's kind of almost impossible to really get it done without recording. And one of the things I've been involved with in recent years has been helping people through, teaching GarageBand, teaching Logic, and teaching production and arrangement classes with kind of empowering songwriters to not be, hopefully, so intimidated by recording and by sound and audio. And today we're not going to talk about any of the specifics of recording hardware or software, but we're going to talk about listening. Because the first and most important part of it really is kind of teaching yourself how to listen, training yourself how to listen. And I just want to start, before we look at a particular example, I want to start with just a couple of basic concepts. One of the big things in listening to recordings is to become aware of contrast. And what that means is that in most successful recordings, there's a really good contrast between different elements, such as highs and lows, what we call wet and dry, which has to do with reverb, dry meaning no reverb, and wet meaning a lot of reverb, and that also involves delays and other effects, things that are large and things that are small. I once heard a great record producer, Daniel Lanois, say, that he thought you could only have a couple of big things on a recording. That one of the mistakes that people made was that they try to make, I want the guitars to sound really gigantic and awesome, and I want the bass to sound big and fat, and I want the snare drum to be, and the vocal, and where do you fit it? Where do you put it? So a big part of recording is you kind of have a certain amount of real estate, and it's really kind of artificial. It's imaginary because it's two-dimensional. But you're trying to create some kind of a three-dimensional effect. And so one of the ways that I like to think about it, and again, we're really just kind of touching on the some basic points here. We don't have a lot of time to get into the technicalities of this. But one of the ways that I think about it is that, like, when you're listening to music, it's sort of like a stage. In other words, the speakers are here, but you're hearing some kind of sound picture. That there's a couple of elements involved in that, and that we can sort of start to listen for, even if we're not that experienced with it. And one of them is what I would call height. And again, these are just very non-technical terms, but that's literally just this. It's the lows, the highs, and the mids. Possibly the biggest mistake that people make in recording when they're not experienced is not being aware that most instruments are in a similar register. In other words, if you sing, let's say if we go from the low, if this is the lowest frequency to the highest, and let's say on the piano, that would include the lowest note on the piano, let's say, is here, again being very not technical, and the highest note on the piano is here. So these are the notes that we can actually hear, and then up here is the overtones, and down here is like the rumbling of the subway, and up here is the dog whistle, and that kind of thing. So in here, the voice, let's say, is somewhere, maybe around here, and guitars, kind of around here, piano, mostly played around here, bass, kind of around here. You get where I'm coming from here? The horn section here, and so, you put the stuff on and you think, that's a good horn part, that's a good this part, that's a good that part, but everybody's in the same place. It's like putting, everything in your refrigerator on the same shelf. You got to put some stuff on the bottom, some stuff in the, in the middle, some stuff on the top. And a lot of that is done with what you choose to record and what parts you choose to put there. But then when you're mixing, it's fine-tuned with what they call equalization, EQ, which is a way that you take things in this frequency range and you pick a spot and you make it louder or softer. and you can sort of pick any spot in that. You know, this is something that you can, it's hardware, it's something there's a piece of software. If you have any kind of a GarageBand or any kind of recording software, you have the ability to do some equalization. You've got to be careful. So I'd say the two main things to be aware of is one is the everybody fighting for the same real estate, and then also that there's a big buildup of lows that happen. Because all of these instruments and voices and stuff, they have a low aspect of their sound. And the lows really build up. And often, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you listen to your recording and it goes, it sounds kind of muddy. Like when I put these professional records on, they don't sound muddy. You know, they sound crisp and they sound tight, and mine sounds kind of muddy. And a big part of that is the buildup in the low frequencies. Another thing we can think about is width. What I'm calling width, which is simply this, and a big part of that is panning. There's a panning knob in a mixer, and you can make one guitar come from this side and the guitar come from that side. You can move things around. You can do some of that with reverbs and delays also. But you want to think about, like, not everything has to be right here in the middle. There's a width to it also that allows you, again, like you're opening up, you're trying to stretch your picture so that you have a lot to play with. There's actually quite a bit of room to play with if you use it. But what we tend to do, as I've said, is we tend to sort of, most of the stuff's in there, and one of the things we've got to think about in recording is not sticking everything in that same place. Another thing is what I'm going to call depth, which is sort of creating the third dimension, like kind of artificially creating a feeling that there's depth in there, that's actually not just coming out of speakers flat. And one of the main ways that's done is with reverb, which creates, reverb is simply, you've heard that word, reverb just means the random bouncing of sound waves off a surface, of any surface. So this room has a reverb, your bathroom has a reverb, that's why you sound really good in the shower, because those tiles make a nice little reverb for you. So with delays and reverbs, particularly, as well as sometimes the way things are recorded, you can create the illusion of depth. With a delay, like if you think about it, there's a little delay on my voice in this room. If I do, we hear the sound of the room, but there's also, it's really kind of inaudible, but coming off the back wall. But when you're in Madison Square Garden or something like that, they hit a note, it comes back off the back wall, a half a second later. That's kind of an example of what we can use delay for, is to create the illusion that there's actually some depth there. There's a room there, there's a space there. So we're trying to artificially create that space, usually artificially. And then another thing that I would call presence, and that is often created with compressors and limiters, and that is increasing the attack of a sound often, and also just increasing the loudness sometimes, just making something louder, which is really what limiters mainly do. So even if you're not using any of these tools, even if you're just recording your music, these are, without adding or subtracting anything, these are some of the things to think about in terms of creating a picture that really works, and not something where it just sounds kind of muddy and cluttered. And and a lot of it has to do with the choices of what you choose to record, and not just like how you mix it, because there are kind of two segments to that. I'm going to pass.